For 26 years, I was the daughter my mother forgot to see. Not hated, just invisible. The kind of invisible where she introduces your sister to every guest at a party, then waves you off with, "Oh, she does something with numbers." That Saturday was my 36th birthday. My mother didn't mention it. The dinner was for Rebecca, my younger sister, the golden child, the one whose photos still covered the hallway wall while mine had vanished at 18:30 guests, crystal glasses clinking. My mother's voice slicing through the laughter. "I'm so blessed. I have two daughters. One is a senior vice president. The other one," she paused, looked at me with that familiar, pitying smile. "Well, she's here too." The room laughed. I laughed along the same hollow sound I'd perfected over 2 decades of disappearing. But this time, something was different. My phone had buzzed at midnight with 3 words from my business partner. "It's done." What no one at that table knew was that I'd spent 6 months preparing for this exact moment, and the document in my purse was about to shatter everything they believed. Have you ever smiled through public humiliation while holding a secret that could destroy everyone's reality? My name is Chelsea Little. I'm 36 years old and I run Lighthouse Capital, a boutique investment firm that specializes in saving family businesses from collapse. In 8 years, I've rescued 23 companies, helped dozens of families keep their legacies intact. The irony isn't lost on me. I save other people's families for a living, while my own pretends I don't exist. The text came on a Thursday morning, 2 days before the dinner. I was reviewing acquisition documents when my phone lit up with my mother's name. My chest tightened the way it always does, that involuntary response I've never managed to train away. The message was brief. "Family dinner Saturday. Rebecca has big news to share." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Saturday was November 15th, my birthday. I checked my calendar anyway, as if the date might have changed since the last time I looked. It hadn't. My mother simply didn't remember or didn't care enough to mention it. I set the phone down and returned to my documents. Disappointment requires hope, and I'd buried that particular hope at 18. The favoritism didn't start as cruelty. I understood that even as a child. When I was 10 and Rebecca was 7, she caught a respiratory infection that nearly killed her. For 3 weeks, my mother lived at the hospital, sleeping in a chair beside Rebecca's bed, bargaining with God. I stayed with the neighbors, the Hendersons, eating casseroles and watching their television and trying not to think about whether my sister would come home. She did eventually, thin and pale but alive. And something in my mother shifted permanently. Her fear of losing Rebecca calcified into obsession. Every cough was monitored. Every fever was an emergency. Every achievement was celebrated like a miracle. I understood. I truly did. My mother had almost lost her youngest daughter, and the terror of that near miss rewired her completely. But 26 years later, Rebecca was healthy, successful, thriving. And the favoritism had become something else entirely. Not protection anymore, but erasure. A family operating system where I simply didn't register. The day I left for college, my mother didn't say goodbye. She was helping Rebecca with a school project, something about a science fair. I loaded my car alone, drove 4 hours to campus, and unpacked in a dorm room that smelled like industrial cleaner and fresh paint. A week later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. This: no return address. Inside cash, enough to cover my tuition for the semester. I called the financial aid office. They had no record of any disbursement. I asked my professors, thinking maybe one of them had noticed a struggling student and wanted to help anonymously. No one knew anything. The envelopes kept coming every semester for 4 years. Same unmarked packaging, same unexplained cash. I never discovered the source. Part of me was afraid to look too closely. In my family, gifts always came with strings attached, and I'd learned young that the price of accepting help was owing something you couldn't afford to pay. After graduation, I threw myself into work. 6 years at Morrison and Associates, learning everything about distressed assets and corporate turnarounds. 18-hour days, weekends in the office. I was running from something, though I couldn't have named it then. At 28, I joined Grace Palmer at Lighthouse Capital. She became the mentor I'd never had, demanding, brilliant, and genuinely interested in my success. By 32, I was running the firm. That Thursday afternoon, Grace called with news I'd been waiting 6 months to hear. Deal closes at midnight Saturday. The board resignations are already signed. You'll have full control by morning. I looked at the acquisition file on my desk. Harmon and Associates. an interior design firm hemorrhaging money and clients. My sister's company. I'll be at a family dinner when it closes, I said. Fitting, I suppose. Saturday evening, I pulled into my parents' driveway. The house looked the same as it always did, warm lights in the windows, cars already lining the street. Inside, I knew my mother was preparing to celebrate Rebecca's success. I walked through the front door and paused at the hallway wall, scanning the frames, 3 decades of family photos. I found the last one that included me, age 18, unsmiling the day before I left for college. After that frame, I simply stopped appearing. Somewhere in this house, my mother was waiting. And somewhere in my bag was a document that would change everything. I stepped into the living room and immediately felt the familiar sensation of becoming invisible. The space was crowded with relatives and family friends, maybe 30 people holding wine glasses and small plates of appetizers. My mother stood near the fireplace with Rebecca at her side, her hand resting proudly on my sister's arm as she introduced her to a couple I didn't recognize. This is my daughter Rebecca, the COO of Harmon and Associates. She's practically running the company now. The couple nodded, impressed. Rebecca smiled graciously, playing her part perfectly. I set my purse on a side table and made my way toward the drinks, and that's when Aunt Caroline spotted me. "Linda, Chelsea's here," she called out. My mother glanced over, and for a moment our eyes met. "Oh, good," she said, already turning back to her other guests. "Chelsea, there's wine on the table. Help yourself." Aunt Caroline tried to fill the awkward silence. "So, Chelsea, what is it you do again? Something in finance?" Before I could answer, my mother waved her hand dismissively. "She does something with numbers. Accounting, I think. 23 companies. I had rescued 23 family businesses from bankruptcy. I had negotiated with creditors, restructured millions in debt, saved thousands of jobs. And my mother thought I was a bookkeeper. The irony would have been funny if it didn't still sting after all these years. I poured myself a glass of wine and found a spot near the window, watching the room fill with laughter and conversation that flowed around me like water around a stone. 6 months ago, I had been sitting in my office when my associate Daniel knocked on my door. "Got a new distressed asset referral," he said, dropping a folder on my desk. "Interior design firm in Connecticut. Hemorrhaging cash, lost 3 major clients in 2 years. They're maybe 18 months from bankruptcy if they don't find an investor." I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. Harmon and Associates. I knew that name. My mother's family had invested in it 15 years ago, back when Rebecca was fresh out of college. It was supposed to be her launching pad, her chance to prove herself. I had heard about it at family dinners I'd stopped attending years ago. I told Daniel I would review it personally, and he left without asking questions. That night, I stayed late reading every document in the file. The company was worse off than the summary suggested. Revenue had dropped 40% in 3 years. They had burned through their credit lines. The leadership was in denial, making decisions based on hope rather than reality. But what stopped my breath was a document near the bottom of the stack, a personal guarantee. My father's name was on it. Robert Little had pledged the family home as collateral for a $2 million company loan. If Harmon defaulted, the bank would take my parents' house. I stared at my father's signature for a long time. It looked genuine, but something felt wrong. I dug deeper, requesting additional records from the company's legal counsel. What I found made me sick. There was a recorded phone call in the files kept for liability purposes. In it, my mother's voice explained to my father that he was signing updated paperwork for their home equity line. "Routine stuff," she said. "Nothing to worry about." He trusted her. He signed without reading. She had lied to him. She had put their home at risk to prop up Rebecca's failing company, and she had done it by deceiving my father. I closed the file and sat in the dark for a long time, trying to decide what to do. 3 months ago, I made a choice I thought was right. I called Rebecca directly. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, and her voice was cold when she answered. "Chelsea, this is unexpected." I kept my tone neutral. "We need to talk about Harmon. I know the company is in trouble. I can help." The silence stretched for several seconds. When Rebecca spoke again, her voice was ice. "Stay out of our business. You left this family a long time ago. You don't get to come back now and play savior." I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to make anyone look bad, that I could send information anonymously, help, without anyone knowing it was me. She cut me off. I said, "Stay out of it. We don't need you. We've never needed you." The line went dead. I sat with the phone in my hand, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not surprise, Rebecca had always been territorial about her position in the family, but there was something in her voice that went beyond defensiveness. She was hiding something. 2 weeks later, I made my decision. If Rebecca wouldn't accept help through the front door, I would come through the back. I would buy the company myself. It took 6 months of quiet negotiation and working through intermediaries, so the little name never appeared on any documents. The existing board was eager to exit a sinking ship. They didn't ask many questions about who was buying them out. They just wanted to be free of the liability. Now I stood in my parents' living room watching Rebecca rise from her chair with a glass of champagne in her hand. The room quieted. "I have wonderful news," she announced, her smile radiant. "I've been promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations." My mother burst into tears of joy. The room erupted in applause. I didn't move, I didn't clap, because I knew something no one else in this room knew. I had read the board minutes from 4 months ago. The company had frozen all promotions and raises due to the cash flow crisis. There was no senior vice president position. It didn't exist. Rebecca was lying standing in front of 30 people and announcing a promotion that had never happened. And suddenly her phone call 3 months ago made perfect sense. She hadn't rejected my help because she didn't need it. She had rejected it because she knew exactly how bad things were, and she couldn't let me get close enough to see the truth. She was protecting her image even as the company crumbled beneath her. My mother stood raising her own glass. The room fell silent again, everyone watching her with warm, expectant smiles. "I am so blessed," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "I have 2 daughters. One is a senior vice president at a major company, a leader, a success." She paused, and I knew what was coming before she even turned to look at me. That familiar, condescending smile spread across her face. "The other one." She let the silence hang for a moment, and a few people chuckled nervously. "Well, she's here too." The room laughed. Not cruelly exactly, politely. The kind of laughter that lets everyone pretend the joke wasn't actually an insult. I had heard variations of this joke for 20 years. At holidays, at graduations, at every family gathering, where Rebecca's light needed a shadow to make it shine brighter. I always smiled along, I always swallowed it down, but tonight something was different. I knew about the guarantee my mother had tricked my father into signing. I knew about Rebecca's lies. I knew about the phone call where my sister had told me I wasn't needed, wasn't wanted, would never be allowed to help. And something inside me finally broke. Not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, like a bone that's been fractured for years, finally giving way. My phone buzzed in my purse. I reached for it, glancing at the screen. A text from Grace, just 3 words: "Done. It's yours." Midnight had passed. The deal was closed. Harmon and Associates now belonged to me. I looked up at my mother, still basking in the glow of Rebecca's fabricated success. I had planned to stay silent tonight, handle everything through lawyers next week, keep it professional. But 26 years of invisibility were pressing against my chest, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to swallow them down. I slipped my phone back into my purse and took a slow breath. The room was still buzzing with congratulations, for Rebecca Glass's clinking voices overlapping with praise and admiration. My cousin Marcus appeared beside me, a friendly smile on his face. He had always been one of the nicer relatives, the kind who actually tried to include me in conversations. "So, Chelsea," he said, genuinely curious, "what do you actually do these days? Your mom mentioned something about accounting." Before I could open my mouth, my mother's voice cut across the room. "She works at some small firm downtown, nothing worth discussing." "Marcus, have you tried the shrimp? Rebecca picked them out herself." Marcus gave me an apologetic look and drifted toward the food table. I stood there holding my wine glass, feeling the familiar weight of erasure settle over me. My mother hadn't even let me answer. She never did. I looked at her, still glowing with pride over Rebecca's fake promotion. I looked at Rebecca, who was studiously avoiding my gaze, laughing too loudly at something an uncle had said. I thought about the phone call 3 months ago. "Stay out of our business. You left this family. We don't need you." I thought about the guarantee document with my father's signature, the recorded phone call where my mother lied to him about what he was signing. I thought about 26 years of being erased from photographs, from conversations, from my own family's memory. And something shifted inside me. I had planned to stay quiet, handle this professionally, let the lawyers sort it out next week. But standing there invisible in a room full of people celebrating a lie, I made a different choice. "Actually, Mom," I said, and my voice was calm, almost conversational. The room didn't quiet immediately. A few people near me glanced over, but most kept talking. I raised my voice slightly, just enough to cut through the chatter. Actually, Mom Rebecca isn't a senior vice president. The laughter died. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. 30 faces turned toward me. My mother's smile froze confused. What did you say? I set my wine glass down on the nearest table. I said Rebecca isn't a senior vice president. In fact, there is no SVP position at Harmon and Associates. The company froze all promotions and raises 4 months ago due to a cash flow crisis. The board minutes are very clear about it. I looked at my sister. Her face had gone pale, her champagne glass trembling slightly in her hand. Rebecca knows this. She was at that board meeting. Rebecca's voice came out strangled. What are you? How do you? I continued as if she hadn't spoken. And as of midnight tonight, Rebecca's position at the company is under review, because I am now the majority shareholder of Harmon and Associates. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Someone dropped a fork. My mother laughed a sharp, disbelieving sound. That's ridiculous. You work at some little accounting firm. You couldn't possibly… I pulled out my phone and opened the acquisition confirmation email. I held it up so she could see. Lighthouse Capital. That's my firm. I founded it 8 years ago. We specialize in acquiring and restructuring distressed family businesses. Harmon was 14 months from bankruptcy when we stepped in. I turned slowly, letting others see the screen. I restructured the debt. I negotiated with creditors. I preserved 40 of 45 jobs. I didn't buy the company to destroy it. The murmurs started then, spreading through the room like ripples in water. Aunt Caroline put her hand over her mouth. Uncle David stared at me like he'd never seen me before. My mother's face had gone from disbelief to something darker, something I couldn't quite read. I looked directly at Rebecca. 3 months ago, I called you. I told you I knew the company was in trouble. I offered to help. Do you remember what you said? Rebecca's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. You told me to stay out of your business. You said I left this family and I didn't get to come back and play savior. You hung up on me. I let that sink in for a moment. So I found another way in. I bought the company through intermediaries. The board was happy to sell. They wanted out of a sinking ship, and they didn't ask too many questions about who was buying. I turned to my father. He was standing near the dining room entrance, his face a mask of confusion and growing dread. When I spoke again, my voice softened. I hadn't planned to do this part. Not here, not like this. But he deserved to know the truth, and I was tired of secrets protecting people who didn't deserve protection. Dad, do you remember signing some loan paperwork last year? Mom said it was routine, updating the home equity line. He nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. Yes, Linda said it was just standard paperwork. Nothing to worry about. I took a breath. That wasn't a home equity update. It was a personal guarantee for a $2 million company loan. You pledged our family home as collateral for Harmon's debt. The color drained from his face. What? If Harmon had defaulted on that loan, the bank would have taken the house. Mom knew exactly what that document was. She told you it was something else so you wouldn't ask questions. There's a recorded phone call in the company's legal files. I've heard it. My father turned to my mother. His voice was barely above a whisper. Linda. Is this true? For a moment, my mother didn't move. Then her wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. Red wine spread across the wood like blood. No one moved to clean it up. Aunt Caroline's voice broke the silence, thin and uncertain. There must be some explanation. Linda, surely there's… A family friend I didn't recognize stood up awkwardly, reaching for his coat. Perhaps we should give you some privacy. This seems like a family matter. Others began to follow his lead, gathering purses and jackets, murmuring excuses. The party was dissolving around us. Rebecca hadn't moved. She stood frozen in place, her champagne glass still in her hand, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then something shifted in her face. Her jaw tightened, her eyes hardened. You always had to be the martyr, didn't you? She said, her voice bitter and cold. Poor invisible Chelsea. So mistreated. So overlooked. You couldn't just let me have this one night. You had to come in and destroy everything. She set her glass down with a sharp crack and walked toward the door. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just walked, her heels clicking against the floor, and slammed the door behind her hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall. My mother finally found her voice. "This is a family matter," she said, trying to regain control, trying to sound authoritative. "Everyone, please, this is just a misunderstanding. Chelsea has always been dramatic. We can discuss this privately and—" "No, Mom." I stood up straighter. "This is my birthday. You didn't remember that, did you? You planned this whole dinner to celebrate Rebecca's fake promotion, and you forgot it was my birthday. Again." I picked up my purse. For 36 years, I have made myself smaller so you could pretend I don't exist. I have smiled through every joke at my expense. I have watched you erase me from this family's story frame by frame, year by year, and I never said a word. I looked at her, really looked at her maybe for the first time. I'm done being invisible. I'm done swallowing my voice so you can be comfortable. And I'm done pretending that any of this is okay. I walked to the front door. No one tried to stop me. The remaining guests parted to let me through, avoiding my eyes. I stepped out into the cool November air and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking, not from anger, from the release of something I had carried for 26 years. I hadn't planned to do it this way. I had wanted to be professional, controlled to handle everything through proper channels. But some silences once broken can't be taken back. I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. My phone buzzed. Grace checking in. I ignored it. There would be time for calls and explanations later. Right now, I needed to breathe. I thought about the company archives I now owned. There was still a document I hadn't fully investigated. A board meeting from 5 years ago referenced in passing in another file, something about a rejected consultation proposal. I didn't know what it contained, but I had a feeling it would change everything I thought I understood about my sister. That investigation could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I just needed to sit with what I had done and what it meant and who I was becoming on the other side of it. The investigation didn't wait until tomorrow. It waited until the following Monday when I walked into Harmon and Associates as its new majority owner. The staff watched me with a mixture of curiosity and fear, unsure what changes I would bring. I spent the first week reviewing financials, meeting with department heads, and assessing which employees were essential and which had been coasting on connections. Rebecca was notably absent for the first 3 days. On Thursday, she finally appeared in my office doorway, her face carefully composed. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. She sat down like she was lowering herself onto broken glass. "So," she said, her voice tight, "what happens now? Are you here to fire me in person? Make sure I feel the full weight of your victory." I leaned back in my chair. "I'm here to offer you a choice. Entry-level project coordinator, no management responsibilities, no corner office. You report to the department head like everyone else, and you prove yourself through work, not connections." Rebecca laughed a bitter, hollow sound. "You're joking. I'm not. If your performance is strong after 12 months, we can discuss advancement. But you start at the bottom like everyone else who doesn't have family pulling strings for them." Her eyes narrowed. "You're enjoying this, aren't you, finally getting to put me in my place?" I kept my voice flat. "I'm not enjoying anything. But I'm also not going to pretend you earned what you had. This is the first fair chance you've ever gotten, Rebecca. The first time in your life, you'll have to succeed without Mom clearing the path. Take it or don't. The choice is yours." She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched the calculations run behind her eyes. She had no other options. Her reputation was shattered. No competitor would touch her after the public implosion at the dinner party. Finally, she nodded once sharply and left without another word. Within days, I heard reports from the staff. Rebecca was struggling, not with the work itself, but with the invisibility. Colleagues who had once competed for her approval now barely acknowledged her in meetings. Junior employees spoke over her. Her suggestions were dismissed or ignored. She was experiencing for the first time in 33 years what I had lived with my entire life. I felt no satisfaction in it, only a tired kind of recognition. The second week brought an unexpected visitor. I was home on a Saturday evening when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find my father standing on the welcome mat, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, his face lined with exhaustion. We hadn't spoken privately in 17 years. I stepped aside and let him in. He sat on the edge of my couch like he might need to flee at any moment. And for a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Those envelopes you received in college, the ones with no return address." My chest tightened. "What about them?" His hands trembled as he pulled them from his pockets and clasped them together. That was me. I sent them. I couldn't breathe. He explained in halting sentences. He had taken side jobs for years, handyman work and weekend consulting, squirreling away cash that Linda didn't know about. He sent the money through a friend's P.O. box, so there would be no trail back to him. I tried to call you twice after you graduated, he said, his voice cracking. Both times you hung up. I understood. I'd been too weak to protect you when it mattered. Why would you trust a number you didn't recognize? I remembered those calls, unknown numbers I had ignored, assuming they were telemarketers, or worse, my mother trying to reach me through someone else's phone. I had deleted them without a second thought. I was a coward, my father continued. I couldn't stand up to your mother. I watched her erase you from our family year after year, and I said nothing. But I couldn't watch you drown Chelsea. I couldn't let you fail when I had the means to help. The rage and grief tangled together in my chest until I couldn't separate them. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't making excuses. He was just telling me the truth finally, after all these years. I wish you told me sooner, I said. It was all I could offer. It wasn't absolution. But when he left an hour later, something between us had shifted. It was a start. The third week, I finally opened the archived board documents I had flagged during my initial review. There was a meeting record from 5 years ago that had caught my attention, referenced in passing in another file. I pulled it up on my screen and began to read. The agenda item was straightforward, a proposal to engage an outside consulting firm for restructuring advice. The firm's name jumped off the page. Lighthouse Capital, my company. 5 years ago, someone at Harmon had researched options for saving the struggling business and found us. They had put together a proposal, gathered data, made a compelling case for bringing in outside expertise, and the board had rejected it. I scrolled to the voting record. Motion by R. Little to reject the proposal, seconded by T. Morrison. Reason cited potential conflict of interest due to family connection. Vote 4-1 against. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Rebecca had known. 5 years ago, she had known about Lighthouse Capital. She had known I had built something successful, something real. And she had actively convinced the board to reject us. She had buried the information, ensuring that our mother would never find out her invisible daughter had made something of herself. For 5 years, Rebecca had kept my success a secret, not out of ignorance, but out of deliberate choice. The confrontation came the following week. Rebecca walked into my office with a rehearsed speech ready, something about the pressure of being the favorite, the impossible standard she had to meet. I cut her off before she could finish her first sentence. I read the board minutes from 5 years ago. The Lighthouse proposal. She went still. The color drained from her face. You knew, I said. You knew about my company. You knew we could have helped save Harmon years ago before it got this bad, and you convinced the board to say no. Then you made sure Mom never found out I was successful. Why? Her voice cracked when she answered, but she didn't cry. If she found out you'd built something real, if she knew you'd made it without her, I would have been nothing. You got to leave Chelsea. You got to escape. I had to stay and be perfect every single day, and still it was never enough. I couldn't let you take the one thing I had. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't expected. She wasn't evil. She was broken. A different kind of casualty of our mother's conditional love, someone so desperate for approval, she had sacrificed her own sister to keep it. Understanding isn't forgiveness, but it made the anger less sharp. The weeks that followed brought consequences I hadn't anticipated. My father hired a lawyer not for divorce, but for protection. He and my mother now had separate bank accounts. She couldn't make any financial decision over $1,000 without his written consent. For a woman who had controlled every aspect of their household for 40 years, this was devastating. The extended family knew the truth now. The friends who had admired her perfect family whispered behind her back. She called me repeatedly. I answered once. I'll talk when you're ready to take responsibility, I told her. Not explain, not justify. Take responsibility. Call me when you can do that. She hasn't called back yet. 2 months after the dinner, a handwritten envelope arrived at my apartment. The return address was Rebecca's. Inside was a single page, no greeting, no signature, just one paragraph. I read it 3 times, then placed it in my desk drawer. I wasn't ready to respond, but I wasn't ready to throw it away either. I kept Rebecca's letter in my desk drawer for 3 weeks before I finally read it again. The first time I had scanned it quickly, my defenses still high, expecting excuses or manipulation. The second reading was slower. The third time, I let myself actually absorb what she had written. I've been trying to write an apology for 2 months. Everything sounds like an excuse. So here's the only thing I can say honestly. I spent 5 years keeping you invisible because I was terrified of becoming invisible myself. I told myself, you didn't need mom's approval. You'd already escaped. I didn't let myself think about what it cost you to escape, or what I was taking from you by hiding your success. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not sure I would. I just need you to know that I finally understand what I did, and I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to see it when it mattered. I didn't respond to the letter. I wasn't ready for that, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. But something shifted after I read it the third time. I stopped dreading interactions with Rebecca at the office. When I passed her in the hallway, the knot in my stomach didn't tighten the way it used to. The anger wasn't gone. I don't know if it ever will be completely, but it was no longer the first thing I felt when I saw her face. There was room now for something else, something I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, maybe just exhaustion with carrying the weight of resentment. Maybe just the recognition that we were both casualties of the same broken system, even if we had responded to it in very different ways. 9 months after the dinner party, I made a decision I had been considering for weeks. Harmon and Associates was stable now. The debt had been restructured, the client base was slowly rebuilding, and the staff had settled into a new rhythm without the chaos of impending bankruptcy hanging over them. It was time for me to leave. I contacted a private equity firm I had worked with before, a reputable group that specialized in mid-sized companies with turnaround potential. The negotiations took 6 weeks. When we finalized the sale agreement, I insisted on one condition: a 12-month employment guarantee for all current staff. Everyone would keep their jobs for at least a year, with retention after that based on documented performance metrics. That included Rebecca. I didn't fight for more than that. I didn't try to protect her beyond what I would do for any other employee. Her future was her responsibility now. She would either prove herself through work the way I had, or she wouldn't. Either way, it was no longer my burden to carry. The sale closed on a Tuesday morning. I walked out of the Harmon building for the last time and felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the quiet relief of setting down something heavy that I had never meant to pick up in the first place. The profit from the sale was substantial. I could have invested it, grown my portfolio, added another zero to my retirement accounts. Instead, I did something that surprised even Grace. I established the Lighthouse Foundation, a scholarship fund for women rebuilding their careers after family estrangement or financial betrayal. Women who had been cut off, written out, left to sink by the people who should have supported them. The application process took months to design. I wanted it to be rigorous, but not cruel; thorough, but not invasive. I wanted to find women who had been knocked down and were fighting to stand back up. The first class had 12 recipients. 12 women, 12 second chances. When I reviewed their applications, I saw pieces of myself in every single one. My father and I started having lunch together once a month. The first few times were awkward, filled with long silences and careful small talk. 17 years of distance don't disappear overnight, no matter how much both people want them to. But he showed up every time. He never canceled, never made excuses, never acted like our monthly lunches were an inconvenience. And that mattered more than I expected it to. Over time, he started telling me things he had never shared before. Stories about his own childhood, about his father's coldness, about the ways he had learned to shrink himself to avoid conflict. He wasn't making excuses. He was trying to help me understand where his cowardice came from, even as he worked to overcome it. I watched him change in small ways. At a family gathering for Aunt Caroline's birthday, he disagreed openly with my mother about something trivial, a restaurant choice or a vacation plan. It was a tiny act of defiance, but I saw my mother's shock. She wasn't used to being contradicted. At another event, someone asked about me, and my father answered before my mother could wave the question away. "Chelsea runs an investment firm in the city," he said. "She's done very well for herself." It wasn't much. It wasn't the fierce protection I had needed as a child, but it was the slow, painful work of becoming the father he should have been. And I had to believe that counted for something. My mother still hasn't offered a real apology. She sent a card at Christmas with a generic message inside: "thinking of you." No acknowledgement of what she had done, no recognition of the harm she had caused. Just two words that could have been written to anyone. I used to think I needed her to change. I used to believe that my peace depended on her finally seeing me, finally admitting she was wrong, finally treating me like a daughter worth knowing. I don't believe that anymore. Some people would rather lose a child than admit they were wrong. Some people will go to their graves convinced that they were the victim, that everyone else is too sensitive, that apologies are for the weak. My mother might be one of those people, and my peace no longer depends on her evolution. I have built a life that doesn't require her validation. That is its own kind of freedom. 1 year after the dinner party, I stood in a rented ballroom watching 12 women receive scholarship checks that would change their lives. They were nervous and hopeful, dressed in their best clothes, clutching folders full of plans and dreams. Some of them had been disowned by their families. Others had escaped financial abuse. All of them had been told in one way or another that they weren't worth investing in. Grace appeared beside me holding 2 glasses of champagne. She handed me one and clinked her glass against mine. 23 companies saved, 12 scholarships funded, and you started from an envelope with no name. I smiled, thinking of my father's hidden support, of the cash he had scraped together from side jobs, of the risk he had taken to help me without my mother knowing. I thought of Rebecca's fear, her desperate need to remain visible in a family that only had room for one successful daughter. I thought of my mother's blindness, her inability to see past her own reflection. Someone believed in me when I couldn't see my own worth, I said. The least I can do is pass that forward. The family I was born into failed me in almost every way. They erased me from their photographs, dismissed my achievements, lied to me, lied about me, and treated my existence as an afterthought. But the family I built chose me. Grace chose me when she made me her partner. My business school friends chose me when they stood by me through the hardest years. These scholarship recipients were choosing to trust me with their futures. That is the family that matters now. That is enough. The sweetest justice isn't making them regret what they did. It's building a life so full of meaning that their approval becomes irrelevant, and realizing at last that you were never as small as they made you feel. Chelsea's story carries a truth that many of us learn too late in life. Your worth was never meant to be measured by the people who refused to see it. For 26 years, she existed in the margins of her own family, overlooked at gatherings, erased from photographs, reduced to a punchline whenever her mother wanted to make Rebecca shine brighter. But Chelsea did something remarkable. She refused to let their blindness become her mirror. She built a career, a purpose, and a life so full of meaning that their approval stopped mattering altogether. If you have ever been the forgotten child, the one who learned to make yourself smaller so others could feel bigger, I want you to understand something important. Their failure to recognize your value is a reflection of their limitations, not yours. Some parents choose favorites and never question the damage it causes. And sometimes, no matter how much you achieve, you will never be enough for people who decided before you could walk that you weren't worth their full attention. That painful truth is their burden to carry, not yours. Chelsea's journey also reveals the heavy price of silence. Her father loved her, quietly supported her from the shadows, but his inability to stand up allowed decades of harm to continue unchallenged. Hidden love is not enough. If you witness someone being diminished, erased, or treated as less than they deserve by the very people who should protect them, your silence becomes part of the problem. It is never too late to find your voice, to speak the truth, to become the protector you always wish someone had been for you. And for those who saw themselves in Rebecca, exhausted from performing perfection, terrified that one failure would cost you everything, please understand this: a pedestal is just a beautiful prison. When your entire identity depends on outshining someone else, you will never know peace. True freedom means building a self that belongs to you alone, not one constructed from someone else's shadow. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If Chelsea's journey touched something in your heart, if it reminded you of your own struggles, or gave you hope for your own healing, I would be honored to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me your thoughts. Were you ever the invisible one? Did you ever have to build your worth from the ground up while your family looked the other way? Your experiences matter deeply, and this community welcomes every voice.